Welcome to NeoCress channel, home of NeoCress Theory. So this proposal for NeoCress Theory centers on the persistence of negative outcomes associated with being black. The economic disparities, the health disparities, the social disparities. Why as black people have we not been able to overcome these problems that have been persistent for so long? And essentially, why have we been so ineffective at fighting against racism? And so the main assertion of NeoCress theory is that problems within the black community remain persistent because black people don't realize that they're in a state of negative selection. And black people don't understand how being in a state of negative selection is affecting their behavior on a subconscious level. The biological and evolutionary scientists are not explaining what negative selection is, and they're not explaining how it causes every problem in the black community globally. NeoCress theory also asserts the reason that black people are in a state of negative selection is because of something called weaponized selection. And I had to coin the term weaponized selection because biologists won't even acknowledge that it exists, even though the science clearly suggests that it does. So NeoCress theory has to reteach certain concepts in evolutionary science in order to reveal those hidden concepts that give us a more precise understanding of what is really happening to black people and historically oppressed populations across the globe. Ultimately, NeoCress theory is an extension of the work of Dr. Cress Welsing, who proposed the Cress theory of color confrontation and racism. Dr. Welsing's goal was to provide a deeper understanding of racism so black people could become more resilient and effective in fighting against racism. Now, NeoCress theory continues in that tradition by combining the work of Edward Osborne Wilson with the work of Dr. Joseph Saul to achieve and even surpass the goals of the original Cress theory. I hope that NeoCress theory informs and inspires the next generation as much as Dr. Welsing informed and inspired my generation. So what do I mean when I say that black people are in a state of negative selection? First, I want to point out that there are many scientific resources and textbooks that explain what negative selection is. The problem is that they too often make negative selection seem like something that only occurs on a cellular level. They make it seem like negative selection is only useful for eliminating harmful alleles from a single strand of DNA. This is why I believe that negative selection is one of the biggest secrets in biology. The fact is that negative selection does not only occur at the cellular level. Negative selection also occurs at the population level, which means that negative selection can affect real people. And that's something that they never explain in the science textbooks. So in order to fully understand what negative selection is, we have to go all the way back to Biology 101, and we have to take another look at the concept of natural selection. But this time, we're not going to teach you the sanitized version. For NeoCress theory, we're going to emphasize that natural selection has two sides, positive selection and negative selection. This is something that Charles Darwin noticed when he took his famous trip to the Galapagos Islands. He was collecting these small birds called finches, and he realized that in niches where the bird's main source of food was small insects, all the birds seemed to have long, thin beaks that were perfect for getting access to small insects. And he also noticed that in niches where the main source of food was large, hard seeds, all the birds seemed to have large, wide beaks that seemed to be perfect for eating hard seeds. So Charles Darwin came up with the theory of natural selection because he realized that each niche seemed to be selecting birds with certain traits and eliminating birds who didn't have those traits. This two-sided dynamic can be described in terms of positive selection versus negative selection. So in a niche where the primary food source was insects, the birds with thin beaks were in a state of positive selection because they had a selective advantage that allowed them to get the most access to food. And birds with wider beaks were in a state of negative selection because the size and shape of their beaks caused them to have less access to food, making it harder for them to survive. But then in the other niche, the opposite was true. Birds with wide beaks were now in a state of positive selection because they could easily crack the large hard seeds, and birds with thin beaks were now in a state of negative selection because their thin beaks were not strong enough to crack the hard seeds. I want to point out that this example is similar to a news article I saw in the Chicago Reporter that discussed how a lot of black people were leaving Chicago because they couldn't find jobs. Since you need a job to survive, this is the same dynamic that Charles Darwin observed in the Galapagos Islands. If white people are able to find jobs in Chicago, but black people are not able to find jobs in Chicago, then that means that in Chicago, white people are in a state of positive selection, and black people are in a state of negative selection. So black people either have to find a new niche where they have more access to jobs, or black people will become extinct. The point is that in each niche, the positive selection group has a selective advantage that allows them to outcompete the negative selection group when it comes to getting resources needed to survive. And the result of the competition is that one group is able to survive and thrive in a niche, and the other group begins to disappear from the niche, either due to migration or extinction. So we need to be clear about why natural selection has both a positive side and a negative side. Positive selection represents the survival of the fittest, so it naturally increases the population of those that have a selective advantage. And negative selection, also known as purifying selection, naturally eliminates those who are struggling to survive because they can't compete with those that have a selective advantage. This two-sided dynamic is very important because it's supposed to help evolution stay on a productive track by separating winners from losers. Evolution has a big job to do. Producing the beauty of nature does not happen by accident. It requires very strict quality controls. Evolution has to have a decisive way to eliminate organisms with the least adaptive physical and behavioral traits. It also cannot waste limited resources on organisms that are not a good fit for the environment. By increasing the population of those with the most adaptive traits and eliminating those with the least adaptive traits, evolution ensures that each new generation is acquiring the adaptations they need to survive and thrive in an ecosystem that is always changing. So now that we understand that natural selection has both positive selection and negative selection, now we can get into the really interesting part. This is where we look at how positive selection and negative selection are reinforced by subconscious processes. This gives us a window into how racism and social inequity operate on a subconscious level. To explain this, we'll focus on the matrix of 4 factors: survivability, fertility, attractivity, and stress. All 4 of these subconscious drivers enable natural selection to be born from the separation of a positive selection group from a negative selection group. So it's not just the environment that separates winners from losers. Our subconscious processes play a big role in creating a bias between positive selection and negative selection. And everything starts with survivability, an organism's ability to survive in an environment, to compete for resources, avoid predators, and stay alive and healthy. Survivability is primarily what determines if you're in a state of positive selection or negative selection. To be in a state of positive selection, you have to demonstrate an increased ability to survive, because an increase in survivability implies a selective advantage over other individuals. A selective advantage that increases survivability also tends to increase reproductive opportunity, which supports an increased fertility rate. So there's a tendency for increased survivability to be associated with an increase in fertility. An increase in survivability is also associated with an increase in attractivity. Attractivity refers to the degree to which an organism is desired by others for the purpose of sexual reproduction. E.O. Wilson does a good job of describing the correlation between survivability and attractivity when he states that desirability is measured in units of genetic fitness, and the emotive centers of the brain are programmed accordingly. By emotive centers, he means the part of the brain that produces emotions and arousal. What this quote is basically saying is that the physical and behavioral traits that make an organism more survivable will also tend to make an organism more attractive. In human society, it's very obvious to us that success makes a person more attractive. People who have large amounts of money can use that money in many different ways to make themselves more attractive to potential sex partners. Physical fitness is also an example of how increased survivability coincides with increased attractivity. It's important to note that attraction is produced on a subconscious level, so people cannot consciously control who they are attracted to. They can try to hide it, but they can't control it. So it's important to understand how indicators of success and survivability generate sexual attraction on an emotional or physiological level. The key point to take away is that the things that make you more survivable also tend to make you more attractive. This association between survivability and attractivity also holds true for specific phenotypes, the same way it affects attractivity for individual organisms. For example, if your subconscious mind draws the conclusion that people with white skin have more access to jobs and resources, and therefore people with white skin are more likely to be successful, then your subconscious mind will force you to become sexually attracted to people with white skin. This is because your subconscious mind internalizes that white skin provides an adaptive advantage, and your subconscious mind wants you to produce offspring who have an adaptive advantage. And likewise, if your subconscious mind internalizes that people with dark skin have a harder time getting jobs and resources, then your subconscious mind will also see dark skin as a natural disadvantage. And your subconscious mind does not want you to produce offspring who will be at a disadvantage. So your subconscious mind will force you to be less attracted to people with dark skin. So you're less likely to reproduce with a dark-skinned person unless they have redeeming traits that can overcome the disadvantage of their dark skin. The same is true for other kinds of traits, like straight hair versus kinky hair, wide nose versus narrow nose, confident behavior versus anxious behavior, good credit versus bad credit. In each case, the phenotype at one end of the spectrum can become much more sexually attractive than the phenotype at the other end of the spectrum, depending on how much that phenotype is associated with an increase in survivability or a perceived selective advantage. And then the final factor in the matrix is stress. Stress actually decreases as survivability, fertility, and attractivity increases. So organisms in a state of positive selection experience very little stress. And since stress can be extremely dangerous to one's health and fertility, having no stress actually supports their survivability, fertility, and attractivity. So in positive selection, it's clear that these four factors amplify each other toward increasing the population of the positive selection group. Increasing survivability naturally provides more reproductive opportunity, which increases fertility, and then increased attractivity provides even more access to sex partners, which further increases fertility. Increased attractivity also means that members of the positive selection group are increasingly attracted to their own phenotypes, which means that they're increasingly attracted to each other, so they're more likely to choose each other as mates, which also helps to isolate their gene pool from being tainted by the negative selection group. And stronger sexual attractivity for one another also urges them to reproduce at an even higher rate. And finally, the fact that they have very little stress is something that supports their overall health and fertility. So they are healthy enough to outcompete others for resources and healthy enough to maintain a high rate of fertility. So we can see how these four factors amplify each other to ensure that the positive selection group increases its population at an increasing rate. So they'll eventually become the majority within the population. In negative selection, these four factors also amplify each other, but in the opposite direction toward eliminating the negative selection group. And this demonstrates just how dangerous it is to be in a state of negative selection. So the negative selection group, by definition, has decreased survivability because they do not have the selective advantages needed to compete for a sufficient amount of resources. And decreased survivability is associated with less reproductive opportunity, which leads to lower fertility rates. Lower survivability also leads to a decrease in attractivity. Decreased attractivity then reduces fertility even more because it decreases access to sex partners. And as the negative selection group becomes less attracted to itself, they also become less motivated to reproduce with each other. Their decrease in attractivity also isolates them from the positive selection group. So all of these factors have a compounding effect that accelerates a decrease in fertility in the negative selection group. Another compounding factor is the fact that decreased survivability and decreased fertility can trigger a stress response, and stress becomes toxic to the body. Stress is so dangerous that it can damage your health even more than the thing that caused the stress in the first place. This is because stress hormones, especially cortisol, are capable of damaging every system in the body. Cortisol at high levels can attack the cardiovascular system and cause hypertension, heart disease, and heart attacks. It can weaken the immune system and leave the body vulnerable to all kinds of infections. It can attack the brain directly and kill brain cells and cause memory loss and degenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. It can trigger respiratory illnesses like asthma. It's associated with diabetes. It can attack the reproductive system and cause infertility and complications during pregnancy. There are so many different ways that stress can damage one's health. Ultimately, stress causes survivability, fertility, and attractivity to decrease at an accelerated pace, which accelerates the demise of the negative selection group. We have always heard that stress can be very dangerous to the body, but no one's ever told us why stress is so dangerous. Stress is dangerous because it's the main enforcer of negative selection, and the goal of negative selection is to eliminate the negative selection group. This is also how we know that Black people are in a state of negative selection, because when we take a close look at how the stress response enforces negative selection, it explains every single problem in the Black community. And this brings us to a concept that I call the 4-vector stress response. This is a concept that's described in Chapter 4 of Dr. Leon Saul's book, The Childhood Emotional Pattern and Human Hostility. The concept is simple. Dr. Saul takes the Freudian concepts of aggression towards the self, or alienation from the self, and he breaks them down in terms of the stress response. So you end up with a conceptual model where the stress response has 2 types and 2 directions. The 2 types, of course, are fight and flight, and the 2 directions are inward towards the self and outward towards others. And from these 2 types and 2 directions, you get 4 possible pathways that the stress response can take. So when fight is directed outwardly towards others, it produces hostility and aggression, which leads to social problems like crime and violence. When flight is directed outwardly, it causes social separation such as divorce and social isolation, which can damage relationships and preclude opportunities. When fight is directed inwardly towards the self, it can lead to negative self-talk, depression, and even self-inflicted injury. When flight is directed away from the self, it can lead to escapist behaviors like drug abuse or food addiction. It can also lead to psychological flight and many other forms of mental illness, which ultimately cause a person to abandon responsibility for oneself or even commit suicide. So when we look at the bottom row of this chart, it becomes clear that the full spectrum of social and psychological problems that plague our society can all be traced back to the fight or flight response. And by tracing these problems back to the fight or flight response, Dr. Leon Saul was trying to make the point that the fight or flight response plays the same type of role that the immune system plays during a disease process. Just like the immune system acts as a natural defense mechanism which produces symptoms, the fight or flight response also acts as a natural defense mechanism that produces symptoms. So if the immune system producing a fever is considered a disease process, then the fight or flight response producing hostility should also be considered a disease process. The same way a fever is an indicator of a pathogen, hostility is an indicator of a stressor. The same way a fever can increase and become dangerous to the body, hostility can also escalate and become extremely dangerous. The similarities between a fever and hostility also extend to the social problems created by hostility, like crime and violence. This implies that crime, violence, and many other social problems should also be considered a sickness. In fact, all of the social and psychological problems that are produced by the fight or flight response should be considered the result of a disease process. And this means that these problems should not be looked at as bad behaviors coming from bad people who made bad decisions. We really need to change that narrative and look more deeply at the subconscious drivers of social problems. Because there is no crime without the fight or flight response. There is no violence without the fight or flight response. All of these symptoms produced by the fight or flight response should be treated as preventable diseases. We have always been taught that our fight or flight response is a defense mechanism that is supposed to protect us. But now we see how our fight or flight response can also produce the full spectrum of social and psychological problems. This duality of the fight or flight response aligns perfectly with the two-sided nature of evolution that is trying to preserve a positive selection group and trying to eliminate a negative selection group. This duality is also why the fight or flight response is the perfect tool for ensuring the integrity of the evolutionary process. This also gives us a clue as to how the process of evolution can be weaponized. If you can put a lot of stress on a targeted group of people, that means that you can turn their stress response against them as their stress response travels through these 4 fight-flight vectors. All of the dysfunction and criminality that are produced by these 4 vectors can then be exploited for profit by institutions, healthcare industries, prison industries, investment firms, and many others. We will go into depth about how the process of evolution can be weaponized, but for now, the important thing to take away is the power of the fight or flight response and how it enforces negative selection by producing social problems, psychological problems, and dysfunctional behaviors that speed up the elimination of a negative selection group. To further understand the power of the fight or flight response and how it enforces natural selection, we have to understand how the fight or flight response creates both social order and social inequity at the same time. By creating social inequity that is entrenched in a social order, the fight or flight response is able to ensure that there's a stress disparity that works to eliminate a negative selection group and preserve a positive selection group, which is what natural selection requires. This is why social inequity is prevalent throughout the entire animal kingdom. It doesn't matter if we're talking about vertebrates or insects. Wherever there's a social order, social inequity is always present. The same is true for human society. Humans have never created a social system that didn't have entrenched social inequity. From slavery, feudalism, colonialism, caste systems, capitalism to socialism, social inequity has been and continues to be ever present in human social systems. To understand why social inequity is so integral to social order, we first have to understand how social order is created in the animal kingdom. In the book Sociobiology, E.O. Wilson explains that social order is born from aggression. And aggression comes about because organisms in a population are competing for 2 things. They're competing for resources to survive, and they're competing for sex partners to reproduce. This competition for survival and reproduction naturally activates the fight or flight response, which produces aggression. As aggressive confrontations occur, Throughout a population, the stronger and more aggressive animals force the weaker animals into a state of submission, and you end up with a hierarchy of aggression and submission. And this is what social order really is. E.O. Wilson explains that social order is really a dominance hierarchy. A hierarchy of aggression and submission that ranks who gets to claim resources and sex partners based on an order of physical dominance. The biggest, the strongest, and most aggressive animals fight their way to the top of the social order, where they have priority access to resources and sex partners. And the weakest and most submissive animals end up at the bottom of the social order, where they have the least access to resources and sex partners. One key point to understand about forming an aggression-submission hierarchy is that there are only two ways that aggression can force others to be submissive, and that is either through violence or through the threat of violence. If an animal is fearful of a violent confrontation, that animal can choose voluntary submission as a way to avoid violence. And that act of submission may protect the animal from death or injury, but it also causes the animal to forfeit access to resources and sex partners. So the trade-off is clear. Avoiding violence comes with the cost of lower social status, just as violence itself can be either very costly for weaker animals or very beneficial for stronger animals. Another key point to take away is that you don't have social order unless all acts of aggression are balanced by acts of submission. It doesn't matter if the submission is forced through violence or if the submission is voluntary, but there must be a balance between the two. Without a balance between aggression and submission, there is no social order, there is only conflict. Social order in human society is also born from a balance between aggression and submission, just like the rest of the animal kingdom. In human society, social order is based on the rule of law, and the rule of law is an aggressive statement that threatens to punish anyone who breaks the law. So when people agree to obey the law, that is an act of submission, which provides the aggressive submissive balance required for social order. Putting someone under arrest is obviously an act of aggression. When police stop you while you're driving, that is an act of aggression, and you are expected to be submissive. Being incarcerated is also an example of physical domination that keeps a prisoner in a prolonged state of submission. So it's clear that a balance between aggression and submission is fundamental to social order in the entire animal kingdom, and human society is no different. It's also important to note that as humans, we do not have social order because we're so civilized and intelligent. The only reason we have social order is because we fearfully submit to authority figures who will punish us with violence if we don't submit to whatever rule of law they decide to create. This also helps us understand why white people tend to be at the top of social orders, while black people tend to be at the bottom of social orders, because white people historically have been on the aggressive side of the social order equation, while black people historically have been forced onto the submissive side of the social order equation. So it's important to note that the racial inequities that we see in society have absolutely nothing to do with justice or morality or politics, and have everything to do with a natural history of aggression, violence, and submission. In his book, E.O. Wilson also explains that once social order is established and the aggression-submission hierarchy becomes stable, the need for aggression and violence decreases, and status signs become the primary way that social order is maintained. Status signs in the animal kingdom include any kind of communication that can be observed, like physical postures and gestures, audible sounds, or body fluid smells that animals use to mark their territory. All of these signs let the more submissive animals know where the territorial boundaries are, so they can stay in their place and not upset the social order. In human society, we also use various signs and signals to indicate our social status and to claim property and sex partners. We also rely on a very sophisticated system of social contracts that dictate the operation of our society through institutions of government, justice, politics, and economics. The key point to understand is that all of these social contracts and institutions were created only after violence and aggression established a social order. For example, the U.S. Constitution could not have been enacted while the Revolutionary War was still being fought. The U.S. Constitution could only be signed into law after the British surrendered control of the 13 colonies. A new aggression-submission balance had to be established first. That's the only way a social contract like the U.S. Constitution could be signed into law. And likewise, the United States of America could not force Japan to accept a new constitution until the Emperor of Japan surrendered to the United States, thereby establishing a new aggression-submission hierarchy that then forced the people of Japan to accept a new constitution. The key point is that establishing and maintaining social order is a two-step process, and aggression and submission always comes before the creation of social contracts. This is why social contracts will never change the social order in a society. The only way to change a social order is by upsetting the aggressive submissive balance. So complaining about unfair social contracts, unfair politics, an unfair justice system, an unfair economic system is just a waste of time, because the unfairness that is inherent in these systems is simply a reflection of the social order that was born from aggression. But we still need to understand why a social order that is based on aggression and submission always seems to produce social inequity. This is because the most aggressive and violent animals are inevitably the ones who end up at the top of the social order. Once they're at the top, they don't just take what they need. They take more than enough resources to secure their own survival and fertility. In other words, they're greedy. And this is where the economics of greed and profit come from. The animals at the top of the social order claim an overabundance of resources and reproductive opportunity, while animals at the bottom of the social order end up with an extreme lack of resources and reproductive opportunity. This ensures that the animals at the top of the social order will remain in a state of positive selection, and they will have very little stress, while animals at the bottom of the social order are forced into a state of negative selection, in which they will have extreme amounts of stress as they struggle to survive. So when we take a look at how both social order and social inequity are produced by a balance between aggression and submission, and then we recognize that both aggression and submission are produced by the fight or flight response, with aggression being associated with fight and submission being associated with flight, this brings us right back to the power of the fight or flight response, and how the fight or flight response acts as the primary enforcer of natural selection. As the fight or flight response creates social orders that are inherently unequal, it also produces various forms of social inequity, including racism, classism, and sexism. The thing that all of these forms of discrimination have in common is that they all fall along the same fault line that divides fight and flight, anger and fear, aggression and submission, the stronger and the weaker, the masculine and the feminine. And it's important to note that being smarter or more intelligent will not help you if you're on the submissive side of the social order equation. There are a lot of very smart people who are oppressed by people who are not smart at all. Just being smart doesn't matter. Intelligence doesn't count for anything until it is combined with aggression. Once you combine intelligence with aggression, now you got something, because all social order is born from aggression. In NeoCress Theory, we focus specifically on racism, and racism emerges naturally from the same competition that establishes social order, which again is a competition for two things: resources to survive and sex partners to reproduce. Everything always comes back to these two natural urges for survival and fertility. Racism emerges because human competition for survival and fertility doesn't just occur on an individual level. It also occurs on a group level. And groupings based on race are formed naturally because race is an inherited trait that indicates kinship and shared ancestry. People from the same lineage are naturally going to be more familial and protective of each other. Race is also a very easy way to identify members of a group. And as people begin to use racial markers to distinguish friends from foes, this causes racial phenotypes to trigger a fight or flight response, and this is what racism really is. In NeoCress Theory, we define racism as something that occurs when a person's race triggers a fight or flight response in others. And by fight or flight response, we're referring to either a fast fight or flight response or a slow fight or flight response. We know all about the fast fight or flight response that is fueled by adrenaline, but we also have a slow fight or flight response that is much more thoughtful and strategic in responding to a threat. Whether the fight or flight response is fast or slow, it still has the same goal of defending against all threats to one's survival and fertility. Since racism emerges from the fight or flight response, that means that racism itself has both a fight component and a flight component. You may have even heard of the term white flight. Since racism also occurs in the context of establishing and maintaining social order, racism naturally causes the competition for survival and fertility to scale up to the group level. Remember, the ultimate goal of the fight or flight response is to create disparities in survival and fertility in order to separate a positive selection group from a negative selection group. The thing that is most elegant about racism is that it can operate completely on a subconscious level through the fight or flight response. So racist people don't even have to know that they're racist. All they have to do is obey their fight or flight response. And we see this in a lot of real life examples of racism. When we look at the fact that black people are more likely to be harassed or killed by police, this inequity is produced by police officers who are acting according to their fight or flight response, which can be triggered by a person's race. When we look at the fact that black people are given longer prison sentences, this inequity is produced by prosecutors and judges who pursue sentencing according to their fight or flight response. When employers are less likely to hire black people, this inequity is produced by hiring practices that are influenced by the fight or flight response. When we see videos of black people being harassed by civilians and so-called Karens who are blocking them from entering apartment buildings, or accusing black people of stealing iPhones, or calling the police on black people for no reason, all of these acts indicate a heightened sense of vigilance towards black people, which is how we know that they're produced by the fight or flight response. So if black people consistently elicit a fight or flight response from white people, then the collective fight or flight response of white people essentially becomes a weapon that marginalizes black people as a group. This puts undue stress on black people and forces black people into a state of negative selection. So to understand how one racial group is able to marginalize another racial group, you have to remember that social order itself is a dominance hierarchy, a hierarchy of aggression and submission. Since social order is born from violence and aggression, racism also takes on those characteristics. Since white people historically have been on the aggressive side of the social order equation, that means they have successfully used violence to fight their way to the top of the social order. This gives them the natural right to claim an overabundance of resources and reproductive opportunity. This also gives them the ability to install and enforce social contracts that maintain the social order and thereby protects their position at the top of the social order. This is how we get the type of social contracts that are at the foundation of our political system, economic system, and system of law enforcement. And this also explains why these social systems consistently demonstrate a bias against black people. It's because white people run these systems according to their fight or flight response, and no one triggers their fight or flight response more than black people. And again, this is the elegance of the fight or flight response that is trying to create disparities in survival and fertility. So it compels white people to take actions that not only increase their own survival and fertility, but also decreases the survival and fertility of black people. And we can see the evolutionary impact of their collective fight or flight response by analyzing it in terms of the 4-factor matrix. When we consider the control that white people have over the economic system, this enables their fight or flight response to increase economic opportunities for themselves while also decreasing economic opportunities for black people. This maintains the survivability disparity that increases the survivability of white people while decreasing the survivability of black people. And since survivability is correlated with reproductive opportunity, this promotes the fertility of white people while hindering the fertility of black people. So once again, we see the fight or flight response creating disparities in survival and fertility. Another example is the control that white people have over law enforcement and the justice system. Even if white people and black people commit the same amount of crime, the fight or flight response of white people motivates them to incarcerate a higher proportion of black people and keeping them incarcerated for longer periods of time. The more black people you incarcerate, the more you reduce the fertility of black people as a group. And the longer you incarcerate black people, the more it reduces black fertility rates. So once again, we see the fight or flight response of white people working to reduce black fertility rates while white people get less incarceration and shorter prison sentences that ensures that white people have more reproductive opportunity and a higher rate of fertility than black people. These disparities in survivability and fertility begin to have an impact on attractivity because you can't be very attractive if you can't get a job or you're sitting in prison. A decrease in attractivity also becomes associated with black phenotypes because people internalize that these negative outcomes are a consequence of being black. And decreased attractivity has a compounding effect that reduces black fertility even more. And finally, the stress response of black people begins to travel through the 4 fight-flight vectors because black people are at the bottom of the social order. They don't have a more productive way to exercise their fight or flight response. Therefore, they end up with the negative outcomes that result from the 4-vector stress response. In this section, we introduce the concept of weaponized selection. In order to understand this concept, we first have to understand the concept that evolutionary biologists refer to as niche construction. Niche construction is when animals make changes to an environment in order to increase their fitness. For example, a bird may build a nest, or bees may build a hive. It's very common for animals to make changes to the environment in order to make it more suitable to their needs. What makes niche construction an important concept is the fact that evolution is an environment-sensitive process. So any changes that are made to an environment can have an impact on the direction of evolution. A change that increases the fitness of one animal may reduce the fitness of other animals. And if extreme changes are made to an environment, it can completely change who is fit for the environment and who is not fit for the environment. That means it is possible to completely take control of the evolutionary process. And this is what evolutionary biologists avoid talking about whenever they discuss niche construction. They fail to acknowledge the fact that humans are different from the rest of the animal kingdom. Humans are capable of making very extreme changes to the environment. That means humans are capable of hijacking the evolutionary process, thereby turning natural selection into weaponized selection. And this is why I coined the term weaponized selection, because evolutionary biologists won't even acknowledge that it exists. So I define weaponized selection as a large-scale or extreme type of niche construction that replaces natural selection pressures with artificial selection pressures that are selective of the constructors or their descendants. It's important to note that weaponized selection can only be achieved by people who are at the top of a social order, people who have unrestricted access to technology and organized manpower, people who have the power and authority to make changes to an environment in order to maintain their power and authority. We saw an example of this in a previous section where white people were able to use their collective fight or flight response to marginalize black people. They were able to do this because they had complete control over the major social systems, the economic system, the legal system, the political system, etc. Having control of these systems gave them the power to exercise their fight or flight response in ways that forced black people into a state of negative selection. And being in negative selection means that your own fight or flight response actually turns against you, so your health and behavior become self-sabotaging. And this is exactly what we should expect from a fight or flight response that is trying to create disparities between a positive selection group and a negative selection group. The only problem with this example is that the context is not natural. Remember, positive selection and negative selection are supposed to represent two sides of natural selection. But in this case, the environment is not natural at all. It's entirely man-made. The economic system is an unnatural system. The judicial system is an unnatural system. The political system is not natural. All of these systems that control society have been constructed for the benefit of white people at the expense of black people. This is why we have to call this weaponized selection. We have to make a distinction between natural selection, which occurs in a natural environment, and weaponized selection, which occurs in a man-made environment that only benefits whoever made the environment. When you understand what weaponized selection is and how living in constructed environments can force you onto the wrong side of evolution, you have to take responsibility for choosing to live in environments that are constructed for the benefit of others at your expense. Another important thing to notice about weaponized selection is the fact that it is caused by the fight or flight response. Since the people at the top of a social order have already proven that they are the most aggressive group, it only makes sense that their aggression would cause their niche construction to graduate into weaponized selection. So once again, we're looking at the fight or flight response as the main culprit. So as we step back and take a look at the role of the fight or flight response, it becomes clear how the fight or flight response creates the full gamut of human pain and suffering. We have seen how the fight or flight response causes social order to be born from aggression and violence. This explains all of the wars we have seen in thousands of years of human history. We have seen how the fight or flight response creates persistent social inequity and many different forms of inequity, including racism, classism, and sexism. We have seen how fight-flight vectors produce the full spectrum of mental and physical problems, as well as society's most persistent social problems, including poverty, starvation, and exploitation. And now we see how the fight or flight response hijacks the entire evolutionary process and turns natural selection into weaponized selection, reshaping our entire reality to only meet the needs of a few at the expense of the many. So after taking stock of all the health problems, social problems, and human suffering that is caused by the fight or flight response, this brings us to the central thesis of NeoCress Theory. In NeoCress Theory, we argue that the next major step in human evolution is when humans overcome the limitations of our fight or flight response. When the structure of human society is no longer determined by our fight or flight response, this will make us less animalistic and push us to a higher level of human cooperation where there is no crime, no poverty, and no violence. Similar to when humans discovered fire and started eating cooked food, which helped us become less animalistic and much more civilized. Visualizing higher levels of human cooperation brings us to another major concept in biology, which is the concept of emergent properties. Our science textbooks tell us what emergent properties are, but they don't give us the full story. And by giving us only half the picture, they're not allowing us to see how a higher level of cooperation can push us to a higher level of human evolution. So once again, we have to go back to Biology 101 and take a closer look at how nature produces higher levels of biological functionality that are also known as emergent properties. Emergent properties occur at each level of biological organization, which starts at the atomic level and scales all the way up to include the entire biosphere. Each level is composed of the previous level. So atoms come together to form a molecule, molecules come together to form an organelle, and organelles come together to form a cell. And at each level, we see emergent properties that the previous levels were not capable of. With molecules, we see the emergence of complex chemical properties. And with organelles, we see the emergence of biological processes. And with cells, we see the emergence of life and all of the properties associated with a living thing. And the cellular level, of course, is a very important level because cells are the building block of all living things, including humans. And since we're trying to gain insight into the potential of humanity, we have to understand how humans are constructed at each level of cellular organization, which starts with a single cell. And then at the next level, billions of cells come together to form a tissue. And then tissues come together to form an organ. Organs come together to form an organ system. And then organ systems come together to form an organism like a human or any other animal. So there's two very important things to understand about the levels of cellular organization that science textbooks don't really emphasize. And that's how emergent properties are associated with extremely large numbers of cells. At each level of cellular organization, there is a vast increase in the number of cells that it takes to produce emergent properties. And at each level, the increasing magnitude of cells reflects the increasing complexity of the emergent properties. Another major requirement of emergent properties is the uninhibited cooperation that exists between the biological structures at each level. You cannot get higher levels of biological functionality if the lower level structures do not share what they do best with each other. So uninhibited cooperation is essential to produce emergent properties. So first, let's look at the vast increase in the number of cells at each level. We start with one cell, which is 10 to the 0 power. And then it takes billions of cells just to form a milliliter of tissue, which is 10 to the 9th power. And by the time we get to an entire human, we have reached a cellular magnitude of 10 to the 14th power. So at each level of organization, we see the number of cells increase by several orders of magnitude. This increase in cellular magnitude really shows the power of large numbers, and it becomes clear why cells are constantly dividing to increase their population, and why humans have high-frequency sex drive that increase our population, because large numbers are associated with higher levels of biological functionality. Another thing to pay attention to is the uninhibited cooperation between the structures at each level of cellular organization. Uninhibited cooperation is an extremely high level of cooperation. When billions of cells come together to form a tissue, they are coming together in a completely unselfish way. Each cell shares what it does best with the other cells in a way that is completely uninhibited. They all work together to produce a higher level of functionality. When tissues come together to form an organ, they each share what they do best with each other in order to achieve a higher purpose. And this is why we have a heart that can pump blood, and we have lungs that can inhale oxygen. All of this biological functionality is produced by an extremely high level of cooperation. And the reason why we need to pay attention to this theme of uninhibited cooperation is because after the organism level, we have the population level. And this forces us to ask a question that most science textbooks will not ask. If billions of cells can come together with uninhibited cooperation to produce a higher level of functionality, then what will happen if billions of humans come together with uninhibited cooperation? What is the real emergent property that we're supposed to produce at the population level? Let's look at this question in terms of cellular magnitude. So at the cellular level, we already had all of the properties of life at 10 to the 0 cells. And then at 10 to the 14th cells, we reached the pinnacle of intelligent life with the human organism and our ability to do higher order thinking. And then at the population level, we have billions of humans, which brings us to a cellular magnitude of 10 to the 21st power. So if we achieve the pinnacle of intelligent life at 10 to the 14th power, then what are we really supposed to achieve at 10 to the 21st power? What is this emergent property that is only possible if billions of humans come together with uninhibited cooperation? I don't think our science textbooks are being completely honest with us, so I asked Google, what are the emergent properties of a population? And Google showed me a quote from study.com that said an emergent property of a population is the ability to work together to make our survival easier. But that doesn't make sense when you consider the cellular magnitude of a population and what cells have already proven that they're capable of at larger magnitudes. If cells are capable of producing highly intelligent life at 10 to the 14th power, then 10 to the 21st power should produce an emergent property that is even more impressive than highly intelligent life. So after doing a little more Googling, I finally found what this emergent property is called. It's called collective intelligence. Collective intelligence emerges from billions of humans sharing what humans do best, which is higher order thinking and ingenuity. So a collective intelligence is like a super genius that has the combined power of billions of human brains. A collective intelligence, in theory, would be able to advance science at a rate never before seen in human history. A collective intelligence would also be able to unlock the deepest mysteries of the universe and invent new technologies that are beyond anything that we even thought was possible. The problem is that human populations are not able to form a collective intelligence because as an emergent property, it requires uninhibited cooperation. And humans are not able to achieve uninhibited cooperation because our ability to cooperate is inhibited by the economics of profit and greed. And the economics of profit and greed are an extension of our fight or flight response. So once again, we've come right back to talking about how the fight or flight response is the biggest problem in human society. It is our fight or flight response that keeps humans divided into different countries and territories. It is our fight or flight response that keeps us trapped in economic systems that force us to chase money instead of chasing the potential of humanity. It's our fight or flight response that keeps billions of people in poverty and prevents them from becoming healthy, highly educated, and highly productive. And even though we have the technology to educate people at a very high rate of efficiency, our educational systems continue to be low efficiency, high stress, and high cost. And there's a reason for that. If you're trying to maintain a system of extreme social inequity, you cannot allow a large segment of the population to become highly educated. You need to be proactive about limiting the number of people who become highly educated. And this is because highly educated people are harder to manipulate politically, harder to exploit financially, and harder to control generally. This is why our educational system is designed to limit the number of highly educated people and give people just enough education for them to be good workers. As long as our collective fight or flight response continues to determine our social order, we will always have extreme inequity that allows a small group of people to oppress and exploit the majority of people. This is why we argue that humanity will not reach the next stage of human evolution until we overcome the limitations of our fight or flight response. And our environment also hangs in the balance. If you look at the levels of biological organization, you'll see that the population level is fundamental to both the ecosystem and biosphere levels. So if we don't get the population level fixed, we will not be able to save the environment because it's not pollution that's destroying our environment, it's money and greed. It's our fight or flight response that's destroying the environment. We already have the technology to save the planet and form a global collective intelligence. But our fight or flight response prevents us from reaching these goals because it keeps us chasing profits instead of chasing something bigger than ourselves. We don't need more technology and we don't need more money. We need to change the way people think. We need a long overdue upgrade for human culture. So how do we upgrade human culture? How do we make sure that our social order is not determined by our animalistic fight or flight response? How do we eliminate the economics of profit and greed and push humanity to a higher level of cooperation? To answer these questions, we have to understand how our economy is an extension of our collective fight or flight response. Remember, the fight or flight response is what causes social order to take the form of an aggression-submission hierarchy. When the most aggressive and violent people fight their way to the top of a social order, they're proving that they can dominate others and force others into submission. This is the power to police. This is the power to enforce whatever social contracts they choose to create. The power to police is also the power to exploit, and this is where slavery comes from. The people at the top of the social order don't just claim a lion's share of territory and natural resources, they also turn people into a resource by forcing people into servitude. This is why slavery has existed for thousands of years, and it still exists today. Employment is just a modern version of slavery. Where slavery was more crude and violent, employment is more dignified and transactional, but they both represent forced labor and exploitation. In either case, if you choose not to work, you will suffer greatly for making that choice. On the aggressive side of the social order equation, the fight or flight response produces greed, and it motivates people at the top of the social order to exploit the labor of others for profit. On the submissive side of social order, the fight or flight response motivates people to sell their labor for less than it's really worth, because that's the only way they can get what they need to survive. And for those at the bottom of the social order, they suffer the most exploitation because they're forced to sell their labor for extremely small amounts of compensation. It's important to understand the role of money in this dynamic between the aggressive side of social order, the employers, and the submissive side of social order, the workers. The first thing we need to understand about money is the fiat currency lie. This is when economists tell us that the money we use is a fiat currency because it's not backed by a commodity like gold or silver. But that's not true. Our currency is backed by a commodity. Our currency is backed by human labor. And human labor is the most valuable commodity because you can do a lot more with human labor than you can with a lump of gold. And as long as people are willing to work for money, the Fed can continue to print as much money as they choose because human labor is not only extremely valuable, it's also a renewable resource. So it's important to understand the whole purpose of money is to extract value from people. All value comes from people, human activity. Without human activity, nothing has value. Food doesn't have value if there's no one around to eat it. Air doesn't have value if you're not able to breathe it. And there's no reason to pump oil from an oil well if there's no one around to use the oil. Since all value comes from human activity, this is also how money gets its value. Money can only gain value when people agree to do work for money. And people only agree to work for money because they think money has value. And so this is the dynamic that enables money to extract value from people, and when they decrease the value of money by creating inflation, this enables money to become even more effective at extracting value from people. And it all starts with this concept of legal tender. Money is legal tender, which basically means that the law of the land is forcing people to use money. This is a reflection of the power to police that has been earned by the aggressive side of social order. On the submissive side of social order, people are forced to work for money because that is the only way they can get access to the resources they need to survive. Working for money would be okay if people were compensated for the true value of their labor, but the people at the top of the social order will never allow that to happen. Their fight or flight response motivates them to use their power to exploit others, so people on the submissive side of social order are forced to sell their labor for less than it's worth. And selling your labor for less than it's worth keeps you in debt, so you remain in a state of perpetual servitude, which generates billions of dollars worth of profits for people at the top of the social order. It's important to note that if people were compensated for the true value of their labor, no one would be in debt and there would be no billionaires. It's also very interesting to see people call themselves poor after they've given away billions of dollars worth of free labor. People complain about income inequality, but if people didn't undersell their labor, there would be no income inequality. And so this is where we get into some real solution proposals. NeoCress Theory offers 3 proposals for laying the groundwork for a more equitable and healthier society that can lead to a higher level of human cooperation. The first proposal is that we have to change the way people perceive the value of money, especially with respect to their own labor, because people have been brainwashed to view money as having value. And people only think of value in terms of dollar amounts or other one-dimensional currency amounts. When we flatten the value of everything into a one-dimensional cost, it's easy to lose track of how much value gets lost to inflation, and it's easy to hide a lot of profiteering and exploitation that is already built into a one-dimensional cost. Since all value emerges from human activity, we should only judge value in terms of skills per unit of time. That's the kind and quality of skills necessary to produce value and the amount of time it takes for a real person to produce that value. When we look at value as something that can only be produced by the skills and time of people, it helps us appreciate the true value of people. And appreciating the true value of people and human labor should make it intolerable for us to see people being forced to undersell their labor as a way to keep them in debt and perpetual servitude. So we have to change the way people look at money. That's the only way we'll break free from money slavery and truly understand that money has no value. Money only extracts value from people. And since all value comes from human activity, that means we have to be extremely careful about how we organize human activity. And this brings us to the second proposal of NeoCress Theory, in which we propose an alliance of profit creators. And by profit creators, I'm referring to both the employees of companies and the consumers who patronize those companies. Companies cannot generate a profit without having both employees and customers. In fact, a profit is really just the difference between what workers are paid subtracted from what consumers are charged. So if the economic activity of workers and consumers can generate billions of dollars in profit, that means their activity can also generate billions of dollars that they can keep in their own pockets. So we propose an alliance between workers and consumers to ensure that the productivity of workers and the purchasing power of consumers are never being used to sustain billionaires. When workers and consumers come together, they can reorganize their economic activity by crowdfunding their own companies that makes it impossible for profit takers to exploit their hard work and purchasing power. Take Amazon, for example. The accusations of unfair labor practices against Amazon have been well publicized, and we all know that Jeff Bezos is at the top of the list of the world's richest people. Now imagine if Amazon employees joined together with millions of Amazon customers and they crowdfunded their own nonprofit version of Amazon. For the cost of an Amazon Prime membership, millions of Amazon customers can completely eliminate Jeff Bezos from the picture and start their own company. And once the billionaires are eliminated, that frees up billions of dollars to increase employee salaries dramatically, while still ensuring that customers get the lowest prices and free delivery with no Prime membership needed. This kind of reorganization of economic activity can be applied to any industry where there are billions of dollars of profit being made, because the weakest link in these industries is always the profit takers. If you eliminate all billionaire profit takers, no one will miss them. And since we already have websites that allow us to crowdfund new business ventures, all we have to do is take that to the next level and start organizing crowdfunding campaigns whose main goal is to make nonprofit competitors to the biggest companies that reap the largest profits. If we use social media the right way, we can eliminate the billionaire profit takers from every industry. So instead of having companies that are focused on extracting profits from people, we can have companies that are acting in the best interest of their employees and customers. This is what I call Web 2.9. Web 2.9 is when we start using social media and crowdfunding to pool our money to displace billionaires. I believe this is what will pave the way for Web 3. And if you don't know what Web 3 is a vision for a decentralized internet that is not dominated by a handful of large corporations. The problem with Web 3 is that it's not clear how to stop large companies from dominating the internet. But if we take steps to decentralize our economy, if we start to displace billionaires by reorganizing our economic activity, that is what will make Web 3 possible. If we can decentralize our economy, we can certainly decentralize the internet. But let's be clear, there can be no Web 3 without first having a Web 2.9. We have to eliminate the billionaires first. And this brings us to the third proposal of NeoCress Theory. This proposal is necessary because if we start to eliminate billionaires, that could actually expose a major problem with our monetary system. If the wealth of billionaires is redistributed to the masses, that could lead to too many people having too much money. And when too many people have too much money, that could actually cause the entire monetary system to collapse. But that's okay, that's really what we wanted to do, because our current monetary system is just not equipped to handle a lot of equality. So this means that we will have to modernize our monetary system. We will have to build a completely new monetary system from the ground up. And it's about time for us to create a new monetary system anyway. In the 19th century, it was the Industrial Revolution that led to the end of chattel slavery and the development of a more modern economy. And now we're at a similar crossroads with the prevalence of mobile technology and the emergence of artificial intelligence. We once again have to reimagine our entire economy. NeoCress Theory suggests that we use this opportunity to build an economy that helps humanity overcome the limitations of our fight or flight response. So we can eliminate the economics of greed and profit and push humanity to a higher level of cooperation. This will lay the groundwork for us to eventually produce the emergent property of a global collective intelligence. And with that goal in mind, NeoCress Theory proposes a 21st century monetary system. A monetary system that forces human competition into a much healthier zone where human competition is all about people trying to reach their potential instead of people trying to exploit each other for profit. Imagine a monetary system where nobody works for anybody, but everybody works for everybody. In such a monetary system, all private debt would have to be illegal. No one would be allowed to be indebted to anyone in a financial way, and no one would be allowed to make a profit off of the work of others. You could benefit from the work of others, but you can't profit from the work of others. So it becomes impossible for anyone to become extremely wealthy from the exploitation of workers. And the way the monetary system would enforce this is by using a universal creditor that we'll refer to as society. Society is basically a computer network that acts like a universal credit card. Society is what pays for everything. That means that no one directly pays for anything. When you purchase something, society pays for it on your behalf. So you owe a debt to society for that thing that you just purchased. And there's only one way to pay your debt to society, and that's when you provide value to other people, and then society pays you on their behalf. So society acts as an intermediary that enables people to focus on exchanging real value with one another instead of exchanging currency, which has no value. Using society as a universal creditor has several other important benefits. First, it decouples payment transactions, so there's no need to have a one-to-one trade of value. This means that the amount of compensation that a supplier receives can be completely different from the amount that the purchaser actually paid. This gives society a lot of flexibility when it comes to managing supply and demand and optimizing the efficiency of the economy. It also means that payment transactions do not have to be limited to a scalar quantity or a one-dimensional quantity. Payment transactions can actually involve a lot of different factors that consider the kind and quality of value exchanged. This also helps preserve the true value of human labor because devaluing human labor begins with flattening it into a one-dimensional cost. And we know that the value that people produce is never one-dimensional. Having a more complex system of payments also eliminates a lot of unethical activity associated with the accumulation of a one-dimensional currency, from profiteering to gambling, speculation, inflation, counterfeiting, compound interest, and price manipulation. Eliminating all of these unproductive financial activities is essential to creating a society that is socially healthier and more civil, because people can no longer focus on the accumulation of money at the expense of others. Another important feature of a 21st century monetary system is the use of technology to ensure that every act of consumption generates immediate compensation for the supplier. This is especially useful for the information economy because this ensures that all information exchanged on the internet is recorded as an exchange of value, so all suppliers are fully and immediately compensated. This also means that people will automatically owe a debt to society for every piece of information they consume on the internet, every video, every news article. Everything you consume will be charged to you as a debt that you owe to society. And everyone's personal wealth will be determined by taking the difference between the value that they have contributed to society minus the value that they have consumed from society. And so this proposal for a 21st century monetary system is just a broad outline of the kinds of consideration that should be made if we're going to build an economy that is not driven by our fight or flight response. Right now, we have an economy where people are only motivated to work because of their natural desire to survive. But what if we had an economy that motivated people to work by supporting their natural desire to reach their own potential? This is an important question to ask because we're living in a time where our 20th century monetary system really is antiquated. It really does need an upgrade, and cryptocurrency is not something that's going to push humanity to a higher level of cooperation. So I hope that this proposal for a 21st century monetary system starts a new debate about how an economy can be designed to limit the aggression of our animalistic fight or flight response. In the final sections of NeoCress Theory, we refocus on the original goal of Dr. Francis Cress Welsing, which was to give Black people the information they need to effectively fight against racism. And now NeoCress Theory redefines racism as the fight or flight response, enforcing both positive and negative selection. So not only does the fight or flight response produce racist activity, but for the victims of racism, their fight or flight response is turned against them. And the 4-vector stress response illustrates how the fight or flight response of Black people becomes weaponized against them. The 4-vector stress response starts with 2 possible triggers. It can start with racist activity intended to cause stress and directly elicit a fight or flight response, or it can start with racial discrimination that limits access to resources or reproductive opportunity. Anything that threatens survival or fertility will trigger a stress response, and once the stress response is triggered, it's like a buildup of pressure that can either be expressed or suppressed. So it can be channeled in 2 directions, either outwardly towards others or inward towards the self. And when the fight or flight response is directed in either of these 2 directions, it produces fight-flight vectors. We'll start with the fight others vector. This is when a fight response is directed outwardly towards others. It produces the kind of hostility and aggression that would normally be used in upsetting the social order and capturing resources needed to survive. But in this case, we're on the submissive side of social order. When you're on the submissive side of social order, you're not allowed to benefit from your own violence and aggression. Instead, you get punished for your violence and aggression. Only the people on the aggressive side of social order are allowed to actually benefit from violence and aggression. This is why the 4-vector stress response does not apply to the people at the top of the social order. It only applies to people on the submissive side of social order because they allow themselves to be punished for their violence and aggression. This is where the notion of crime comes from. The people at the top of the social order determine what crime is, and they decide who gets punished. This is why the fight others vector functions like an incarceration trap that supports the mass incarceration of black men. By using racial oppression to activate the fight or flight response of black men, they become subject to incarceration when their fight or flight response produces aggression in the form of crime or violence. It doesn't matter that their aggression is a direct response to racial oppression. Every time a black man is caught in this incarceration trap, their incarceration only further solidifies their state of negative selection. Incarceration severely decreases survivability and reproductive opportunity. Being incarcerated can also force them into slavery, as their labor is exploited by the prison system. And even when they get out of prison, they find that they have virtually no opportunity to escape a state of negative selection. The hostility produced by this vector doesn't just function as an incarceration trap. Hostility can also lead to a lot of negative consequences due to the fact that hostility is extremely dangerous and contagious and can turn into many different types of social problems. When hostility is not being used in an adaptive way to upset social order and increase social status, hostility becomes maladaptive and self-sabotaging and causes all kinds of abuse and domestic violence. It damages relationships, it can tear families apart and traumatize children. So hostility does a lot to sabotage people on a personal and social level, and this is what leads to all kinds of dysfunctional behaviors that are associated with high poverty or negative selection communities. As a former teacher in inner city schools, I observed firsthand how dynamic hostility flow had a negative impact on my middle school students. As a teacher, I really only had 4 problems: student hostility towards the teacher, student hostility towards the learning process, student hostility towards each other, and student hostility toward rules and routines. Once I realized that student misbehavior was really student hostility, I gained a new respect for the dynamics of hostility and how it enforces negative selection by producing academic failure. Another thing that makes hostility a major problem is the fact that it is so elusive. And the reason it's so elusive is because we call hostility by so many different names. We call it disrespect, we call it bullying, we call it abuse, we call it violence, we call it crime, we even call it justice. We call hostility by so many different names that it never gets the credit it deserves for causing so many problems in our community. And because it goes unrecognized, we end up allowing hostility to trick us into fighting each other when we should really be trying to solve the problems that are at the root of the hostility. This is why Dr. Leon J. Saul wrote a book about the dynamics of hostility. He wanted people to completely change the way they looked at hostility and the way they responded to hostility. The main thrust of his book is that hostility should be treated like a highly contagious disease. Treating hostility like a disease means that we focus on fighting hostility. And when we focus on fighting hostility, we are no longer fighting each other. The next vector we'll discuss is the flee others vector. This is when the flight response is directed away from others. This kind of flight is all about physical separation from others, but it can also be about emotional separation from others, as well as abandoning one's responsibility to others. This is the kind of flight that can break down the family structure and not only cause alienation between parents and their children, but also leads to the full spectrum of negative outcomes associated with single-parent households or kids who get stuck in the foster care system. This type of flight can also lead to social withdrawal or social isolation, which precludes healthy relationships and opportunities, including reproductive opportunities. And then there is the fight self vector. This is when the fight response is suppressed or repressed and thereby directed inward towards the self. This leads to things like negative self-talk, which causes depression. This vector can urge someone to physically injure themselves or engage in a wide range of self-destructive behaviors. It can also produce mental illnesses that lead to self-sabotage or self-destruction. The high cortisol levels associated with chronic stress also represent a form of self-destruction as high levels of cortisol are very harmful to the body and are also a direct threat to the reproductive system. I don't think it's a coincidence that the stress response produces a chemical like cortisol that can damage the body in so many different ways and effectively reduce both survivability and fertility. Since the stress response is the primary enforcer of both positive and negative selection, it makes sense that the stress response will provide a reliable mechanism for decreasing the survivability and fertility of people who are in a state of negative selection. And finally, there is the flee self vector, where the flight response is directed away from the self. This vector occurs when people try to escape the pain that they feel inside of themselves, whether it's emotional pain or physical pain or a feeling of overwhelming stress. People will try to find relief in many different ways, including self-medication, which can lead to drug addiction or food addiction or other types of unhealthy dependencies. Escaping from yourself can also take the form of psychological flight or mental illnesses that are triggered as a defense mechanism. The abandonment of responsibility for oneself is also a form of self-escape, and psychological flight, mental illnesses, and drug addictions can all escalate and become so debilitating that a person can no longer take care of themselves. So these conditions can ultimately force a person to abandon responsibility for themselves, which is the most severe form of self-escape other than suicide, which represents a complete escape from the self. So it's important to understand how the 4-vector stress response model gives us a big picture view of what is really happening to the Black community. These 4 vectors yield 3 major pathways that are destructive to the Black community. There's the mishandled hostility pathway. Mishandled hostility is highly contagious. It causes people to attack each other, and it leads to a wide range of social problems. There's a toxic cortisol pathway. High levels of cortisol become toxic to the body and cause a wide range of health and fertility problems. And there's the psychopathy pathway, where psychological problems produce the full spectrum of dysfunctional and self-sabotaging behaviors. The key point to take away is that Black people are destroying themselves because their fight or flight response has been weaponized against them. A long history of oppression has maintained stressful conditions specifically for Black people. When you induce a long-term stress response in a targeted group of people, the stress response becomes a weapon. The stress response enforces negative selection, which eliminates the group by producing a full spectrum of mental, physical, and social problems. And what's even more dangerous than these problems is our perception of the problems. It's not just that we perceive these problems as being caused by Black people who only have themselves to blame because they made bad decisions. What's dangerous is that we perceive these problems as an inevitable consequence of being Black. This is dangerous because our perceptions are absorbed by our subconscious mind. And when the subconscious mind starts to associate being Black with negative outcomes, this further weaponizes our subconscious processes to the point where Black people become subconsciously biased against themselves. And this negative self-bias comes from many different sources. Take the media, for example. When the media reports on disparities that are caused by a long history of racism, they never emphasize that racism is the cause of the disparities. So they say things like, Black people have a higher risk of heart disease. Black people have a lower life expectancy. If you're Black, you're more likely to be unemployed. When the media consistently associates negative outcomes with being Black, instead of reframing these outcomes as a product of racism, the power of suggestion causes people to internalize that negative outcomes are an unavoidable consequence of being Black. And so the Black community subconsciously puts the blame on itself and begins to see itself in a negative way. The Black community loses respect for itself. There's no trust. Expectations are low. Hostility is high. So you end up with a cross product between the fight self and the flee self vectors operating at the group level, meaning that the Black community as a whole begins to both attack itself and run away from itself. And this dysfunction also has a negative effect on sexual relationships. causing a decrease in attractivity between black women and black men, which is often referred to as colorism. In order to gain a deeper understanding of negative self-bias and colorism specifically, we need to take a closer look at the subconscious processes that drive it. And the first thing we need to understand is the separation of responsibilities between the conscious mind and the subconscious mind. The subconscious mind is what urges us to meet the most basic evolutionary requirements: survival and reproduction. If no one is motivated to survive, or if no one is motivated to reproduce, the evolutionary process completely breaks down. So at the very minimum, the subconscious mind has to urge us to survive and reproduce. And then our conscious mind has to figure out the best way for us to survive and reproduce in a particular environment. Since evolution is an environment-sensitive process, our conscious mind is responsible for being aware of the environment and learning about the environment and figuring out how to navigate and adapt to the environment so that we can survive and reproduce in an environment-adaptive way. The separation of responsibilities between the conscious mind and the subconscious mind necessitates a feedback loop of communication where the subconscious mind produces emotions, physical urges, and subconscious thoughts in order to direct the interests and aspirations of the conscious mind, while the conscious mind delivers intelligent perceptions of the environment to be absorbed by the subconscious mind. As the subconscious mind absorbs information about the environment, it forms subconscious beliefs, and it's these subconscious beliefs that determine exactly how our subconscious processes will operate in different situations. Take emotions, for example. Our emotions influence our decisions and behavior by using an animalistic punishment and reward system. On the reward side, we have positive emotions that make us feel good, like happiness, excitement, and pride. On the punishment side, we have negative emotions that make us feel bad, like anger, sadness, and fear. And our emotions are situation specific, which means that our emotions will either punish us or reward us depending on the type of situation that we're in. So imagine a situation where you just won $100 million in a state lottery. In that situation, your subconscious mind would produce positive emotions at a very high intensity. So you'll become extremely happy about winning $100 million. The reason your subconscious mind produces emotions that make you feel extremely good is because of the subconscious beliefs involved. Your subconscious mind believes that a large amount of money will buy you everything you need to ensure your survival and fertility. Money buys food, shelter, healthcare, and all the resources you need to survive. Money also increases reproductive opportunity. So your subconscious beliefs about money produce positive emotions in order to reward you for being in a situation that promotes your survival and fertility. The subconscious belief that money promotes survival and fertility can also produce negative emotions. Let's say that your $100 million lottery ticket accidentally fell into a puddle of mud and all of the ink dissolved, so the numbers on the ticket are no longer legible. Now that you just lost a huge jackpot, your subconscious mind now produces negative emotions that make you feel extremely bad. This is how your subconscious mind punishes you for losing a lot of money. Your subconscious mind believes that losing a lot of money is not good for your survival or fertility, so it has to make you feel bad in that situation. So by making us feel good in some situations and making us feel bad in other situations, our emotions train us to prefer some situations over others. The situations that make us feel good are the situations that promote our survival and fertility. And the situations that make us feel bad are the situations that are not good for our survival or fertility. And from the time that we're born, our subconscious mind is training us to pursue situations that are good for our survival and fertility. So we think that we're in pursuit of happiness, but we're actually in pursuit of our own survival and fertility. This emotional training is what causes us to develop a subconscious desire for money, which actually helps to bolster the value of money. So if internalized beliefs are what determine our emotional responses, what happens when people internalize that having dark skin makes it harder for you to get money? What happens when people internalize that being a black person makes it harder for you to survive? The same way your emotions can train you to choose having money over not having money is the same way your emotions can train you to date a light-skinned person over a dark-skinned person. And this is why the issue of colorism is so hard for the black community to get a grip on, because it operates on a subconscious level, an emotional level. People think that they just happen to fall in love with a light-skinned person, or they just happen to fall in love with a non-black person, and they treat it like it was just an accident of nature. And they don't realize how their subconscious mind forced them to have stronger feelings for a lighter-skinned person. This is why we need a more complete understanding of how the subconscious mind produces attraction in a selective way. If your subconscious mind has internalized that having dark skin or tightly curled hair makes it harder for you to survive, then your subconscious mind will discourage you from producing children that have dark skin or tightly curled hair. Your subconscious mind trains you to do what's best for your child. You subconsciously want your child to have every advantage. And giving your child every advantage starts at the point of sexual selection. It starts with the traits that you are attracted to in a sex partner. And the traits that have proven to be the most survivable will also be the traits that are the most attractive. But a lot of people don't want to admit this to themselves. They're in denial about the fact that they have internalized that dark skin puts you at a disadvantage that you have to work twice as hard to overcome. They don't realize that their subconscious mind is forcing them to be more attracted to lighter skinned people and less attracted to darker skinned people. And the black people who are conscious of their preference and openly admit that they are not attracted to dark skinned people, they get attacked and ostracized by people who don't understand how colorism operates on a subconscious level. So how do we solve the problem of colorism? How do we stop black people from being biased against themselves? And more importantly, how do we get to a point where we can say that black is beautiful because we have truly internalized that on a subconscious level? In order to reverse black self-rejection, we have to understand the second leg of the feedback loop, where intelligent perceptions of the environment are absorbed by the subconscious mind and used to form subconscious beliefs. If our emotional processes are driven by subconscious beliefs, we have to take control of how we internalize subconscious beliefs from the time that we're born. This leg of the feedback loop also reveals the true power of weaponized selection. Weaponized selection is all about controlling the environment and controlling people's perceptions of the environment. And since perceptions are what lead to subconscious beliefs, weaponized selection makes it possible to control the development of people's subconscious beliefs from the time that they're born. And this is how, for example, we have been brainwashed to love money and hate each other. So how is it even possible for black people to fight against weaponized selection? If your entire reality is falsely constructed and you have developed so many subconscious beliefs from an environment that is completely man-made, how do you change your reality? How do you break free from the matrix? As black people, we have to fight weaponized selection on two fronts. We have to stop stressful economic and social conditions, which causes our collective stress response to keep us in a state of negative selection, and we have to identify and change the internalized beliefs that cause us to be subconsciously biased against ourselves. On the economic battlefront, our first priority should be to establish a black protective economy, which is an economic infrastructure that prevents black people from giving away billions of dollars worth of free labor. Remember, the aggressive side of social order uses money to force people to undersell their labor. By stopping money from extracting the true value of black labor, we can keep billions of dollars worth of value from leaving our community and prevent so-called income inequality. A black protective economy will also protect black people from the extreme employment inequities caused by a long history of employment discrimination. racially targeted disinvestment and economic exclusion, as well as job displacement enabled by undocumented workers. Establishing a Black protective economy will require a Web 2.9 approach. In NeoCress Theory, we define Web 2.9 as using the internet to organize a massive number of people in order to make massive changes to the economy. Making large-scale changes to the economy requires us to take stock of our collective talents and skills and develop a plan to rebuild our economic infrastructure in a way that decentralizes the economy and displaces the world's richest people. A major goal of Web 2.9 is the complete elimination of traditional profit takers. Profit takers are people who benefit from the spread between low wages and high prices. Anyone who pockets the difference between low wages and high prices is a menace to society because they're exploiting both workers and consumers. By eliminating the traditional profit takers, this means that a company's profits can only be paid out in two ways, either in the form of employee bonuses or consumer rebates. There's no dividend, there's no owner's distribution, and this is important because profit taking is a hindrance to decentralization, and the main goal of decentralization is to transfer control of the economy from the few to the many. Web 2.9 is also important because right now they're trying to get us to buy into a vision of Web 3 that is basically controlled by profit-taking capitalists. Right now there are investors pouring money into so-called Web 3 companies. These capitalists are trying to use their money to dictate the future of the internet and the future of money. And it's imperative that we begin to push back against these so-called Web 3 companies because the future of Web 3 has not been written yet. And as Black people, we need to write our own future. If we allow white capitalists to determine the future of Web 3, then a truly decentralized internet will never become a reality. We must have a Web 2.9 decentralization of the economy before we can have a Web 3 internet that is truly decentralized. And if we're going to decentralize the economy, this is the perfect opportunity for us as Black people to develop a Black protective economy. So what does a Black protective economy look like? A Black protective economy features fully Black supply chains that employ Black people from one end of the supply chain all the way to the other end of the supply chain. So a Black-owned grocery store will be full of products produced by Black-owned companies and delivered by Black-owned logistics. The entire operation will be Black-owned. And when we say Black-owned in this context, we're talking about decentralized Black ownership, where Black companies are owned by workers and consumers who actually do business with the company. So Black workers and consumers are essentially investing in each other, and no one is making a profit off of them. Another important feature of a Black protective economy is that it appreciates that people are the real capital. So that means that unemployment is the biggest threat to the economy. If anyone is unemployed, then that represents unused capital that brings down the value of the entire community. In a Black protective economy, there is no excuse for unemployment because there is always some kind of work that needs to be done. And because we have eliminated the traditional profit takers, our economy doesn't have to be limited to just profit-making businesses. Our economic activity can be driven by the actual needs of the community and not because there's a profit to be made. A Black protective economy is basically a crowd-funded form of social capitalism that is for the people and by the people. It's about creating something that we are fully invested in because it belongs to all of us. By bringing Black workers and Black consumers together, we can plan and build a Black economic infrastructure that is protective against systemic racism and weaponized selection. It can also provide real reparations in terms of improving the conditions within the Black community. But of course, forming a Black protective economy will not be easy. There will be many hurdles to overcome, and the biggest hurdle will actually be us. The fact that as Black people, we are subconsciously biased against ourselves. The lack of trust and the lack of respect that too many Black people show towards each other. The hostility that tricks black people into fighting each other instead of solving problems. The colorism that prevents black people from seeing their own beauty. If we do not form a black protective economy, it will be because of these different acts of self-sabotage that black people consistently commit. After all, self-sabotage is what people do when they're in a state of negative selection. And since black people are in a state of negative selection, we need to be very intentional about reversing the social and psychological problems that come along with that. Reversing these problems means that we have to change the internalized beliefs that are at the root of these problems. And changing our internalized beliefs will require us to do two things. We have to take control of the media that we consume, and we have to take control of our educational systems. So first, let's talk about taking control of the media that we consume. As black people, we can no longer consume media that shows us as a struggling minority because that reinforces colorism. In order for us to eliminate colorism and increase our attractivity to each other, we must begin to create and consume media that projects us as a successful majority. Seeing ourselves as successful will help us develop the subconscious association of black phenotypes with success or increased survivability. When we internalize that black phenotypes are associated with increased survivability, our subconscious minds will allow us to become more attracted to our own phenotypes. And not only will this help black people see themselves as more attractive, but it will also help black people develop more trust, respect, and confidence in each other. Black media programming should also project black people as a majority. When we show black people in large numbers and being in control of large institutions, the subconscious mind begins to internalize that the black population is very large. This is important because a large population suggests reproductive success. When we internalize that our phenotypes are associated with reproductive success, this also allows the subconscious mind to develop increased attractivity to black phenotypes. This dynamic is kind of like that episode of The Twilight Zone where the woman thought she was ugly because she didn't look like everyone else in her society. We have to understand that beauty is not in the eye of the beholder. Beauty is determined by large populations and other indicators of success. And since being on television is an indicator of success, we have to acknowledge the negative impact that the last 100 years of television programming has had on the way black people view themselves. By taking control of our media consumption, we can eliminate colorism and negative self-bias in the black community and also reinforce messaging to keep black people on the same page with supporting a black protective economy and preventing our stress response from being weaponized against us. Black media companies should also be an integral part of the black protective economy. Black media companies should be created using a Web 2.9 approach so the entire black community can claim ownership of its own media industry. Through crowdsourcing, we can make it easier for talented black people to get discovered, and the black community can have more control over who and what they want to see on their media services. We need to stop paying for cable and streaming services if we're not actually controlling both the content produced and the opportunities provided by these services. So a decentralized entertainment industry is a crucial part of a black protective economy. It also means that we can finally have a music industry that doesn't exploit artists. So hopefully, we can get back to making great music again. In addition to taking control of the media that we consume, we must also take control of our educational systems because the kind of education that black kids require is completely different from the type of education that white kids require. With white people being in the state of positive selection and black people being in the state of negative selection, that difference alone accounts for the racial achievement gaps and other racial disparities that persist in the educational system. You cannot effectively educate kids who are in a state of negative selection without directly addressing all four of the fight-flight vectors. As I mentioned before, when I was a teacher, I could see that student misbehavior was a misnomer, and the real problem was student hostility. And this was confirmed when I started to do research, and I found that student misbehavior wasn't just correlated with race and poverty, but the actual mediating factors was things like harsh parenting, interparental conflict, parental endorsement of aggression, and parental depression. And one of the things that all of these factors have in common is that they're all related to hostility, including depression, which can be seen as hostility towards the self. This is why we must take control of our educational system. And education should teach a person how to survive. So if you're not teaching black kids how to cope with being in a state of negative selection, or if you're not teaching black kids how to effectively fight against racism, then you're not giving black kids the type of education that they need. If black kids are properly educated about what it means to live in a racist society and why it's so important for them to control their own economy, then they won't see their own blackness as a problem and they'll be able to develop a more positive view of themselves. We also need to establish a system of high efficiency education, which means that we finally learn how to use computers to educate kids in the most efficient way possible. We have known for a long time how to use computers to make kids addicted to video games. We know how to make people addicted to social media. But when it comes to an educational context, somehow we never figured out how to make kids addicted to learning. Remember, the powers that be do not want a population full of highly educated people. So they want to keep our educational systems low efficiency, high stress, and high cost. This is another reason why we have to take control of our educational system. Establishing a system of high efficiency education is critical to teaching black kids the wide range of skills that they'll need in order to support a black protective economy. A highly efficient educational system will also provide more time for black kids to engage in social activities and social skills instruction. We need to start giving black kids direct instruction on how to develop healthy relationships within their own community. So a major portion of the curriculum will be devoted to socializing and relationship building. With a healthy socialization plan in place, there should be no need to separate black boys and girls into different schools. And so that's basically it. This proposal for NeoCress Theory has presented both a theoretical framework and a set of recommendations for neutralizing systemic racism and pushing humanity towards a higher level of cooperation. I just want to close by saying that developing a black protective economy has to start on the internet. It has to start with a locus of influencers that are smart enough to do the research and planning and capable of leading a large-scale effort to organize millions of people in order to change our society. We have a lot of highly intelligent black influencers that are capable of getting the ball rolling, and the NeoCress channel is all about reaching out and collaborating with influencers to make these proposals a reality. But first, we have to make sure that everyone in the global black community understands NeoCress Theory. None of our recommendations will become a reality if we don't get the word out about NeoCress Theory and begin to start changing the way people think about many different issues. So the primary focus going forward will be to engage the public, raise awareness of NeoCress Theory, and challenge people to look at things from a NeoCress perspective. That means challenging people to change the way they think about the value of their own labor, so they're not duped into giving away billions of dollars worth of free labor. Challenging people to think differently about money, so they can stop looking at money as having value. Challenging people to change the way they use social media, so instead of fighting each other and being messy, they can actually come together and build their own economy. Challenging people to think differently about society's biggest problems so they can understand why these problems are created by the fight or flight response. Challenging people to think differently about colorism and negative self-bias in the black community so we can understand how our subconscious beliefs have been weaponized against us. And challenging people to look differently at hostility so they can start fighting hostility instead of fighting each other. This proposal for NeoCress Theory has been inspired by and is a tribute to Dr. Francis Cress Welsing, Dr. Leon Joseph Saul, and Dr. Edward Osborne Wilson.